Have you ever truly listened to silence? Not the silence of the void, of mere emptiness, but the silence that is pregnant with stories yet to be told, with whispers buried by the sands of time. In the first pages of human history, between the resonant call of God in the cool of the day and the seductive hiss of the serpent in the brush, there exists a profound stillness. It is in this space that the forgotten faces dwell, where the first heartbeats of the unnamed daughters of Adam and Eve once echoed. The scriptures tell us of Cain, the man of the soil, whose sweat mingled with the dust he tilled. They tell of Abel, the man of the flock, whose gentle spirit mirrored the lambs he tended. Their names reverberate through the millennia, one an eternal symbol of sin and rebellion, the other a tragic emblem of slain innocence. But have you ever paused between these sacred verses and wondered, in that first human household, outside the lost walls of Eden, who else was there? When Eve collapsed, her hair a tangled veil over a face racked with a mother's grief for her two sons, who was there to wrap a trembling arm around her shoulder? Who saw the storm clouds gathering in Cain's eyes, the tempest of a soul raging, long before it unleashed a murderous hurricane? The answer lies not in what was written, but in what was left unspoken. It lies in the overlooked verses, in the names never carved into the stone tablets of history. They were the daughters of the dawn, the silken threads that bound that first family together, and they were the ones who stood at the crossroads of destiny, where each path would lead humanity toward a vastly different future. They were not merely silent witnesses, they were choosers. Today, we will not begin by seeking an answer to an old question. We will begin by seeking them. We will call their names out from the oblivion of the past, pulling them from the shadows of history. Awan, the daughter who carried the wild fire of the earth within her. Azura, the daughter who held the purity of the heavens in her soul. This is not just the story of Cain and Abel, or of Seth who came after. This is their story. And through the journey of these two first women, we will discover a staggering truth. From the very infancy of our world, the fate of mankind was not forged by the sword alone, nor by the offerings on an altar, nor by the curse of God. It was also shaped by the quiet choices, the silent decisions made in the deepest chambers of a woman's heart. One choice to follow the shadow for the sake of love, and one choice to embrace the light from the ashes of despair. Join us now. Take a deep breath and pull back the veil of the past. Let the silence speak. Let us listen to the story of shadow and dawn, a tragic epic woven not by kings or prophets, but by the two first daughters of Eve. The world outside of Eden was a raw and majestic canvas, an unfinished masterpiece of the Creator. Mountains stretched their proud peaks to touch the clouds, rivers flowed like silver ribbons across the land, and endless fields lay waiting for the hand of man to bring them to life. Against this magnificent backdrop, the first four children of humanity grew up together. They breathed the same pristine air, drank from the same clear streams, but their souls quietly diverged, like small brooks that would eventually flow into different oceans. Cain, the firstborn son, seemed to have been molded from the earth itself. He carried the silent pride of the stone and the stubbornness of the soil. His shoulders were broad and powerful, his hands were calloused and rough from relentless labor, and his gaze was always fixed on the distant horizon, the gaze of a conqueror, not a contemplative. He spoke little, but in his silence lay a smoldering fire of ambition, an iron will that sought to bend the earth, to force it to yield its most bountiful harvests under his command. He did not ask, he demanded. And there was one who always watched that fire with an unconcealed fascination. That was Awan, the first daughter, possessing a wild beauty and a free spirit. Her hair was as black as a moonless night, and her large eyes shone with an unquenchable curiosity. Awan was not afraid of Cain's gruff, brooding nature. On the contrary, she was drawn to the raw power and unwavering determination that radiated from him. In her eyes, Cain was not just a farmer. He was a builder, an architect, a man who dared to confront and challenge the harshness of this new world. She would often bring him water in silence as he toiled under the hot sun, and they would share long moments without words, an understanding that needed no voice. In complete contrast was Abel, the second son, who carried the gentleness of the sky and the tenderness of the sheep he shepherded. If Cain was the earth, Abel was the air. He did not seek to conquer. He sought to nurture. His heart was as pure as a mountain spring, and his prayers ascended to God as naturally as the fragrant smoke from a holy incense. He found joy in helping a ewe give birth, in bandaging the leg of a lost lamb, in simply watching the stars ignite in the night sky. And the one whose soul found perfect harmony with his was Azura, the next sister. She had eyes as blue as the sky after a cleansing rain, and her smile seemed to possess the power to make the most beautiful wildflowers bow in admiration. Azura found absolute peace and security in Abel's presence. She would sit for hours, weaving garlands from the most vibrant wildflowers, while Abel played his flute, his haunting melodies seeming to blend with the air itself, bringing serenity to all creation. From Abel, she learned patience, unwavering faith, and a love that was unconditional, a love that did not seek to possess. The four of them, two pairs of kindred souls, grew up in a delicate harmony, a fragile balance. Awan admired Cain's strength. Azura cherished Abel's gentleness. But even in those most peaceful and idyllic days, a seed of division was quietly sprouting. It was an unspoken comparison, an irreconcilable difference in their worldview, in their approach to God. One sought to seize blessings with his own strength. The other believed blessings came only to a humble heart. That seed, small and harmless at first, like a single weed, was silently stretching its roots in the garden of their young hearts, waiting for the day it would erupt and shatter everything. The sky on that fateful day was a grim, oppressive shade of grey, hanging heavy like a leaden shroud. The wind no longer whispered, but shrieked across the fields, carrying the chill of a terrible omen. And then the destined day arrived. It did not come with a thunderclap from on high, but crept into the first family with a dreadful silence, a deathly stillness upon the fields. Abel did not return with his flock as the sun bled into the horizon. The event at the altar of offerings had become an unhealable fracture in Cain's already pride-filled soul. The fire from heaven had descended, consuming Abel's offering of the firstborn lamb in a brilliant blaze, an undeniable sign of divine acceptance. Meanwhile, his own offering, the fruits of his labor, merely smoldered, producing a weak, listless smoke that dissipated into the air, a silence from God that was more painful than any rebuke. That rejection was not just an event, it was a slap to his ego, a negation of his entire effort and self-worth. Envy, that toxic seed the serpent had sown long ago in Eden, finally found fertile ground in Cain's heart. It germinated with terrifying speed, growing into a monstrous vine that coiled tightly around his heart, strangling all affection, all reason, leaving only a blind and seething rage. When Adam found Abel's body amidst the wildflowers in the field, the first family truly collapsed. Eve let out a heart-rending scream, a sound not of a human but of a mother animal whose young has been stolen. Her agony now was 1,000 times greater than the pain of being exiled from paradise. The pain of losing immortality could not compare to the pain of losing a child at the hands of another. Adam stood frozen, a statue of grief. His broad shoulders now seemed to sag, not just under the weight of the first sin, but under the weight of the second, a sin even more horrifying and unimaginable. He had brought sin into the world, and now that sin had brought death into his very home. But in this earthquake of grief, there were two other pains, quieter but no less profound. Azura collapsed beside her brother, her soulmate, her kindred spirit. Her gentle world of trust and love had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The garland she had woven for him that morning, still fresh, lay discarded beside him, its petals seeming to wilt in sorrow. The one for whom it was intended was gone forever, and the melody of his flute would never be heard again. And Awan, from a distance, looked at Cain, her brother, the man she had secretly loved and admired. He was standing there, in the middle of the field, his back to his family, a solitary black figure against a blood-red sunset. But the person before her was no longer the strong builder she had been infatuated with. His eyes were empty, devoid of soul. His hands, the hands that had once sowed the seeds of life, were now stained with a deep crimson that no river in the world could ever wash clean. Awan's world also shattered, not by a death, but by a truth far more terrible. The monster she feared most was the very man she loved most. The first murder did not just take a life. It carved an uncrossable chasm between the living, a chasm of blood, of sin, and of eternal silence. The first family was broken. The curse was pronounced from the mouth of the Creator, not in a voice of rage, but in one of sorrow and weariness. Cain, the first murderer, was to become a restless wanderer, a fugitive with no place to call home, exiled from the presence of the Lord and spurned by the very ground he once loved and cultivated. The earth would no longer yield its strength to him. He was to be a perpetual outcast upon the face of the planet. Upon hearing the judgment, Cain felt fear for the first time. "My punishment is more than I can bear," he cried out. "Whoever finds me will kill me." These were not the words of repentance, but the words of terror for his own life. Yet God, in his infinite and incomprehensible mercy, did not abandon him completely. He placed a mark upon Cain's forehead, a mysterious, faintly glowing sigil. It was not a mark of shame for all to see, but a seal of divine protection, a warning to any who would harm him that vengeance would be taken on them sevenfold. Cain began to gather his meager belongings, a few stone tools, a leather pouch of seeds now rendered useless, and a single cloak. He prepared to depart, to step into a future of uncertainty and solitude, a lonely journey to the east. His family watched him, a complex mixture of fear, anger, and a lingering pity for the son who was now lost to them. But only one person did not just watch. Awan, her heart hammering against her ribs, stepped forward, separating herself from the family circle. Her heart felt as if it would burst from her chest. Her reason, the voices of her parents, of safety, screamed at her to stay. To stay beside Adam and Eve, who needed her now more than ever. To stay and comfort Azura, her sister drowning in grief. To stay was the right thing, the safe thing. It was kinship. It was remaining within the fading warmth of God's presence. But her heart, a wild and foolishly loyal heart, told her something entirely different. She looked at Cain's solitary back, at the strange mark glowing faintly on his brow in the twilight, and she saw more than a cursed murderer. She saw a soul shattered to its core, a man who would have to face the eternal darkness he had created all by himself. And she could not bear the thought of it. Eve frantically grabbed her arm, her voice urgent. "Do not go, my daughter. That darkness will consume you. You will be lost." Adam merely looked at her with pleading eyes, eyes that held 1,000 years of sorrow. Azura, from behind, whispered her name like a breath of wind, but Awan shook her head, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. "I cannot leave him alone," she whispered, a sound barely audible. "If he must walk into darkness, I will be his only light." It was not a choice of logic, not a decision weighed with pros and cons. It was an instinctual choice, a choice born of a tragic and perhaps blind love, a loyalty so misplaced yet so fierce it could burn through all reason. With one final resolute nod, she turned her back on her family. Each step away felt heavy, as if she was severing an invisible cord that connected her to her very roots. Awan had crossed the line, leaving safety, leaving kinship, to follow Cain into the land of Nod, the land of wandering. She had chosen her path, a path that ran parallel to the shadow, clinging to the faint, almost delusional hope that the small light from her own heart could bring warmth to a soul that had been cursed and frozen forever. The land of Nod, which lay to the east of Eden, did not welcome them. It was a barren place where hot winds seared the skin, and only thorny shrubs had the tenacity to survive. The ground was hard and cracked beneath Cain's feet, a constant physical reminder, a mocking persistence of God's curse. Every seed he attempted to sow was a struggle against a hostile earth. Every tool he fashioned from flint was an act of defiance against his fate. He was no longer the master of the soil. He was a beggar pleading for life from a planet that had turned its back on him. In those first desperate and rage-filled months, it was Awan who kept the flame of their existence from being extinguished. When Cain would collapse, slamming his fists into the unforgiving ground in impotent fury, she was the one who would quietly approach, offering him a sip of cool water from a leather flask. When night fell and the howls of wild beasts echoed from the distance, stirring a primal fear, she was the one who bravely built a fire, its light pushing back not only the darkness but also the demons in their minds. She would tell him stories of the past, of their childhood, a fragile attempt to connect him to the humanity that remained within. They did not merely survive. With a will that was nothing short of extraordinary, they began to build. With their bare hands, they erected a crude shelter of branches and animal skins, then a more permanent hut of clay and stone. When their firstborn son, Enoch, was born in that wilderness, it was not just an event of life. For Cain, it was a declaration. He looked at the small infant in his arms, an innocent being who bore no mark of the curse, and a new resolve ignited within him. He would not let his son be a wanderer. He would build a legacy for him, a legacy that would defy God himself. They began to build a city, the very first city in human history. Others, perhaps their other siblings who had since departed, or their multiplying descendants, were gradually drawn to the fire and the fortitude that Cain had established. Together, they hauled stones, mixed mud, and erected walls. It was an act of absolute defiance. If God had condemned him to wander, he would create a place to put down roots. He named the city Enoch after his son to carve his legacy into stone and mortar. The city grew, and their descendants multiplied. They became a people of inventors, of pioneers. Jubal, a descendant, fashioned the first lyres and flutes, and music was heard for the first time in history, melodies that could soothe restless souls and stir worldly passions. Tubal-Cain, another, unlocked the secret of forging iron and bronze. He created sharper tools to conquer nature, to till the stubborn soil, and also to create the first weapons, gleaming knives and spearheads. The legacy of Cain and Awan was a legacy of innovation, of self-reliance, of a phenomenal effort to rise from the ashes of a curse. But it was also a legacy built on a foundation of separation from God, a foundation of pride and self-sufficiency. Their city may have been strong, their music beautiful, their weapons powerful, but deep within every citizen there was an unfillable void, a nameless longing for a garden they could never return to. Awan, now a mother and a grandmother, would sometimes stand on the city walls, gazing west, and wonder if her choice had truly brought any light, or if she had merely helped build a more magnificent kingdom for the darkness itself. While Cain and Awan struggled to build a worldly kingdom in the east, a heavy silence had fallen over Adam's household. The grief of loss and the sting of betrayal had left a scar that would never fully heal. The shadow of Cain and his crime loomed over everything, and laughter seemed to have vanished from the earth. But even in the darkest night, God did not forget his promise. A new light dawned, A tender shoot of hope sprouted from the barren soil of despair. Eve gave birth to another son. As she held the infant in her arms, her face, already deeply lined with sorrow, was illuminated by a renewed hope. She named him Seth, a name meaning appointed or granted. She said to Adam, tears streaming down her face, but this time tears of consolation, God has granted me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. Seth was not a mere replacement for Abel. He was a continuation, a restoration. He grew up possessing the gentle heart and kind spirit of his lost brother, but there was also a quiet strength in his eyes, the strength of resilience and hope. He did not carry the burden of pride like Cain, nor was he as purely innocent as Abel. He was the balance, a bridge between a tragic past and a future that needed redemption. And the one who carefully nurtured that seedling of hope, watering it with love and faith, was Azura. The pain of losing Abel, her soulmate, had nearly turned her heart to stone. She lived the following years like a shadow, her smile extinguished. But the birth of Seth melted that frost. In Seth's clear eyes, she saw a reflection of Abel, but she also saw a new future, a chance to begin again. Azura became the keeper of memory. She told Seth stories of Abel, not in a tone of mourning, but one of pride. She spoke of his kindness, his pure faith, how he talked to his sheep as if they were his friends. She taught Seth how to listen for God's voice, not just in direct pronouncements, but in the whisper of the wind through the leaves, in the murmur of the brook, in the profound silence of the stars. She passed on Abel's spiritual legacy to the brother who was appointed to continue it. When Seth grew into a strong yet gentleman, Azura became his wife. Their union was not a fiery, passionate, and tempestuous love like that of Awan and Cain. It was a union of kindred souls, a peaceful and profound partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared faith, and a purpose far greater than themselves: to preserve the flame of faith that Cain had tried to extinguish with his brother's blood. They did not build cities of stone and pride. They built a community of prayer and love. When their firstborn son, Enosh, was born, a momentous event, a turning point in the spiritual history of mankind, occurred. The scriptures record a short but incredibly significant verse. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. These were no longer just individual prayers. Under the guidance of Seth and Azura, for the first time, people gathered together, looked up to the heavens together, and raised their voices together to call upon the Creator. They had created communal worship. The legacy of Seth and Azura was not in physical inventions or architectural marvels. Their legacy was the restoration of the sacred connection between humanity and God. They had chosen a path entirely different from Cain and Awan, a path that did not look outward to conquer the world, but inward to find peace and worship the one who created it. They were sowing the seeds of a new garden, a spiritual garden, upon the very land that had once been soaked with tears and blood. From their source in the two daughters of Eve, Awan and Azura, the two great rivers of human history began to flow. They sprang from the same family mountain, but immediately veered in opposite directions, carving out two distinct valleys, two civilizations, two destinies. They flowed parallel to each other for centuries, sometimes within sight of one another, but never to merge. The river of Cain and Awan flowed fiercely, torrentially, and powerfully. It was a river of the earth, of stone, always carrying the silt of innovation, but also the mud of ambition. From its inception, it created great waves that crashed against its banks, eroding and reshaping the landscape around it. On the banks of this river, great cities rose like giant boulders, architectural works that challenged the very sky. Its waters echoed with the clang of Tubal-Cain's forge, the music of Jubal's lyre, and the boisterous clamor of marketplaces. Their descendants were the giants of their age, men whose names were recorded through their worldly achievements. They were the pioneers, the inventors, the rulers, who believed that destiny lay in their own hands. They were the world builders. But their waters also grew increasingly murky, stained with the colors of pride, violence, and an ambition that knew no bounds. They trusted in the strength of their own hands and the tools they created, more than in the providence of a god they felt had abandoned their ancestor. This river was majestic, impressive, but whoever drank from its water felt a thirst that was never quenched, an anxiety that always lurked beneath the glittering surface. In contrast, the river of Seth and Azura flowed silently, gently, and persistently. It was a river of the heavens, crystal clear and deep. It did not create violent waves, but flowed serenely, meandering through meadows, bringing life and lushness wherever it passed. The banks of this river had no fortified cities, only simple tents, flocks of sheep grazing, and stone altars erected under ancient trees. Its waters did not echo with the sound of the forge, but with whispered prayers, the soft flute melodies of shepherds, and the laughter of children playing in peace. Their descendants were not famous kings or artists. They were shepherds, farmers, people whose hearts were turned toward the heavens. Their legacy was not measured in gold or land, but in the depth of their communion with the Creator. They taught their children that true strength came not from forging a sharp sword, but from kneeling in prayer with a humble heart. This river seemed weak and unremarkable, but its water was pure and sweet. Whoever drank from it felt their soul cleansed and at peace. Two rivers, two destinies. On one side, the glory of man. On the other, the glory of God. One sought immortality through works that would be destroyed by time. The other sought eternal life through a connection to the Eternal One. The history of the first generations before the flood is the story of the contrast, the ever-widening gap between these two paths. Two choices that originated in the depths of the hearts of the first two women. Awan, who chose to step into the darkness hoping to light a candle, and Azura, who chose to remain with the light and turn it into a beacon. The profound opposition between the two lineages, between the two paths of humanity, is perhaps nowhere more clearly and symbolically illustrated than through the lives of two men who lived in different eras but shared the same name, Enoch. The first Enoch was the son of Cain and Awan, the hope and the very reason for building an earthly legacy. His name was given to the first city, an everlasting symbol of man's effort to create his own permanence, to defy the curse of wandering. As this Enoch grew, he did not look to the heavens. He looked at the city walls growing ever higher, at the streets becoming ever more crowded. He was the prince of a self-made kingdom, a kingdom of human will and strength. His legacy was not a relationship, but a construction. The city of Enoch was the pinnacle of Cainite civilization. It had high walls to defend against enemies and wild beasts, bustling markets where goods were traded, forges that were always ablaze with the sound of hammers ringing, and palaces where the music of Jubal never ceased. It was a magnificent monument to human power, creativity, and survival. But it was also a fortress built out of fear, loneliness, and separation from God. This Enoch's legacy was brick and mortar, bronze and iron, a tangible, impressive legacy, but one that would ultimately be worn down by time and dust, returning to the very earth from which it came. Centuries later, a second Enoch appeared in the line of Seth. This man was the seventh descendant from Adam, a number signifying divine completion and holiness. This man built no city. He left behind no technical invention. He forged no sword, composed no music. The only legacy the scriptures record of him is a single, concise sentence, yet one that holds extraordinary power and an unimaginable intimacy. Enoch walked faithfully with God. The phrase "walked with" implies something far deeper than mere belief or worship. It describes a daily relationship, an intimate companionship, an unbroken conversation between a mortal man and the invisible Creator. For this Enoch, God was not a distant being in the heavens to be feared or petitioned. He was a constant companion on every road. His life was a wordless prayer. Every step he took on the earth was an act of worship. His relationship with the Creator was so intimate that the fragile veil between the earthly and the heavenly seemed to have dissolved for him. He lived on the earth, but his soul was already somewhere else. And then, after 365 years of walking together, a number symbolizing a complete solar year, the scriptures record a miraculous and unique event. Then he was no more, because God took him away. He did not experience death, did not taste the painful separation of soul and body. He simply transitioned from his walk on earth to his walk in heaven, a transition as gentle and natural as moving from one room to another in the same house. One Enoch had a city named after him, a legacy of pride. The other Enoch had all of heaven awaiting him, a legacy of faith. One sought immortality through the works of man. The other found eternal life in communion with God. Through these two figures of the same name, we see clearly the two final outcomes, the two destinations of the paths that Awan and Azura had unknowingly chosen for their descendants centuries before. The river of Cain, the further it flowed from its source, the more violent and uncontrolled it became. The initial pride of a farmer wanting to prove his worth had now mutated into a culture of open violence and extreme self-aggrandizement. The seed of sin that Cain had sown did not just grow into a single tree. It had become a dense jungle, completely obscuring the light of truth and compassion. This degradation was epitomized in the figure of Lamech, a descendant in the 7th generation from Cain. As a dark contrast to Enoch, his contemporary in the line of Seth, Lamech did not walk with God. He swaggered in his own arrogance. He was the first to break the covenant of monogamy, taking 2 wives, Ada and Zillah, and then, before his wives, he sang a song, not a song of love or creation, but the song of the sword, a chant of revenge, a boastful and bloodthirsty declaration. He bragged shamelessly, "I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times." This was no longer self-defense. This was brutality. The protection God had granted Cain was twisted by Lamech into a license for limitless vengeance. He arrogated to himself the power of God, the right to decide life and death, and multiplied it exponentially. The darkness that Cain had carried from the field where Abel fell now completely enveloped his lineage. The creativity they once prized now served the cause of war and destruction. The bronze plowshares of Tubal-Cain had been reforged into swords and spearheads. The music of Jubal was no longer used to soothe the soul, but had become military marches, battle cries, anthems to celebrate slaughter at feasts of excess and debauchery. The earth began to groan under the weight of wickedness. Human evil was no longer a series of isolated acts. It had become a system, a way of life. The cries of the innocent, of the weak oppressed by the strong, once again reached up to the heavens. It was like the cry of Abel's blood long ago, but now it was not the cry of one man, but the shriek of thousands, of tens of thousands, a mournful chorus from a world that was destroying itself. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the line of Seth steadfastly held to the faith of their ancestors. They lived like small oases of peace in a raging ocean of violence and despair. They watched the world around them sink into darkness and were horrified. They were like flickering candles in a hurricane, trying to keep the fragile light of righteousness and the fear of God from being completely extinguished. They lived, they prayed, and they waited. They did not know what would happen, but they held a deep conviction that God's patience was immense, but his justice was also certain and inescapable. The world was ripe for judgment. The division between the two lineages was no longer an invisible boundary of belief. It had become an uncrossable chasm between life and death, creation and destruction. And in the sky, Dark clouds, clouds of a kind never seen before, were beginning to gather, heralding a great rain, a cleansing by water, preparing to wash everything away, save for one fragile glimmer of hope, floating on a ship that was not yet finished. And then the rain began to fall. At first, it was just sparse drops, causing those lost in their debauched feasts and murderous rampages to look up at the sky in surprise. Rain was a strange phenomenon, for before this, the earth had been watered by a mist that rose from the ground. But then the drops became heavier, turning into a white sheet of water. Water did not just fall from the sky. The fountains of the great deep burst forth. Rivers overflowed their banks, and the oceans roared. The great flood had begun. This was not a capricious act of destruction by an angry God. This was a cleansing. It was God's painful but necessary response to a world that had become rotten from the inside, a world where every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. It was a great surgery to remove the malignant tumor of sin, to give humanity a chance to start anew. The fortified cities of the line of Cain, those monuments to human pride and will, collapsed like sandcastles against the power of the floodwaters. The city of Enoch, Cain's pride, with its towering walls, was submerged. The music of Jubal, the hammer of Tubal-Cain, and the vengeful song of Lamech were all drowned out by the roar of the water, silenced forever by death. The entire legacy built of brick and stone, of ambition, talent, and violence, was washed away without a trace. The path of Awan, the path of choosing to walk with the shadow in the hope of redeeming it, had reached its tragic end. The darkness was not redeemed. It had consumed everything, including itself. But amidst the chaotic sea of destruction, another legacy survived, a legacy built not of stone, but of gopher wood. It was a simple, enormous wooden ark, constructed not with superior engineering or human innovation, but with absolute faith and steadfast obedience. Aboard that ark was Noah, the last descendant of the righteous line of Seth and Azura. He had spent 120 years building this vessel amidst the ridicule and skepticism of everyone around him, an act of phenomenal faith. Now, he, his family, and the creatures God had commanded were safe inside, floating on the waters of judgment. For 40 days and 40 nights, the waters covered the earth. When the flood finally receded, and the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, the door was opened. Noah and his family stepped out into a new world, a world washed clean. And then, in the sky, a sign appeared. The first rainbow, a brilliant 7-colored ribbon, a covenant from God that he would never again destroy the earth by water. Human history would begin again from a single family, once more. But the story of Awan and Azura, the story of the silent women who stood at the first turning point, would never be forgotten. It is an eternal reminder, etched into the very soul of humanity. Awan, the daughter who chose love over safety, left a tragic lesson on the futility and inevitable end of a legacy without God. Azura, the daughter who chose faith over despair, became the mother of the lineage that would bring salvation to the world. Who was Cain's wife? The final answer is not just a name, whether it was Awan or someone else. The answer is a story about choice, about the two paths that are ever present before every human being. And that story still echoes today in the depths of each of our hearts, where shadow and dawn are perpetually at war, where the two rivers still flow. Which path will you choose?